Hello, my name is Michael Maltzan from Los Angeles. I'm glad to be here today with you. It's a very auspicious day here in the United States, and definitely an interesting time to be thinking about personal histories as well as cultural, social, and urban histories. I'm going to just share my screen. What drove me to architecture and what continues to motivate me has always, I realize, been an ambition to make connections between things, people, to an idea about the future, to a place. Saying that seems in many ways simplistic, but for me, it's very profound. I have to imagine this ambition to try to find those connections as related to my own history and experiences. And it's also where I find pleasure, joy in architecture, which is something Furman asked about earlier. It's the place where architecture makes sense to me. The rest of architecture, frankly, can often be very hard. My family is mostly from the New York area, with my father's parents coming from German immigrants. My grandfather was a skilled sewing machine mechanic in New York's garment district. It was a long day. He worked 7 days a week, which is why I often saw him sitting in that easy chair. My mother's family were all Irish. Also, their family had recently immigrated. My grandfather meant an enormous amount to me. He was a truly adventurous spirit, driving motorcycles, flying biplanes, and he was extremely present in the world. Their whole family would make trips on a very regular basis to the west, to the far west, in the summers, for instance, the Grand Canyon, where this picture of my mother as a child was taken. I remember seeing these pictures and being in love with the scene of openness and possibility that they seemed to communicate. And I fantasized about going there one day. But I was born and grew up for the first 10 years of my life in the post-war Levittown suburbs on Long Island outside of New York City. They were new then. The suburbs were really a new idea and way to live outside of urban centers. My father was a salesman for hospital equipment in the city and would commute back and forth. My mom had been trained as a teacher, but like many women of that generation, became housewife, housemaker, and mostly involved with raising the family. I have four sisters, all younger. I'm the oldest of the five kids. The house we lived in was on 15 Page Lane in the Levittown suburbs, in the P section. And like all the other houses built there, it had a kind of architectural secret, I felt. Architecturally appeared very traditional, but inside there were many clues to a rapidly modernizing lifestyle. The kitchen was right at the front door and was the center of activity in the house. There was a double-sided open fireplace that connected the living room and the kitchen. There were huge plate glass windows to the backyard that made it seem like the inside and the outside were completely connected. It was an architecture that also allowed the house to grow and transition to meet the needs of growing middle-class families. It was, in that way, very modernist in its ambitions. I also believe, for me, that the suburbs are where I began to learn how to see, to observe with a type of discrimination to try to figure things out. Most people think of the suburbs as soulless, repetitive places. But for me at that age, it was a kind of paradise. We went everywhere, between yards, riding our bikes until nightfall, cutting through overgrown side yards to see our friends. It was really a place of adventure. Within all of that repetition, it in a way forced you to see things in a more experiential, subtle way, to look for important differences and distinctions in the built landscape and then the semi-natural landscape, to see beauty in unlikely places. For me, for instance, in the storm basin that every part of the neighborhood had, an overflow basin for large rainfalls that we would call the sump. It was a place that was overgrown, had become a kind of feral and wild landscape. And for me and my friends, we were constantly jumping the fence to play there. It was our magical forest, if you will. It was also a moment, and I think for a generation similar to myself, it was a moment in time of contradictions between tradition and an emerging new world. I was, like many kids at that time, mesmerized by the space program and the sense of adventure the astronauts and their rockets created, NASA created. I'm sure I was affected also by the aesthetics and the design of it, the forms, the materials, the colors, and the graphics. Naturally, I, like all my friends, wanted to be an astronaut, although I came to realize afterwards that I was somewhat claustrophobic and that wasn't going to happen. In contrast to that sense of wonder and openness in the space program, and in many of the technologies that were starting to develop. I also went to Catholic elementary school, which was exactly the opposite: traditional, rigid, prescriptive, times punitive. My memory of being there was that I was always afraid. I often lived, because of that, I think, in daydreams while I was in school, which meant I wasn't really seen as a good student, a reputation that stuck with me for a long time. By the late 1960s, that emerging world, the conflict in that world, was finding itself everywhere. The world was in a deeply conflicted moment, and that world began to creep into the suburbs as well. My parents decided that they had had enough and that it was time to move us all away. We left for upstate New York to a small farm town named Skaneateles, which was one of the Finger Lakes in the middle of the state. The town was surrounded a very beautiful lake formed millions of years ago by glaciers. It was an idyllic landscape of forests, apple orchards, and dairy farms. It also snowed a lot. I had one truly great friend, Kevin Maloney. We did everything together, model rockets, biked everywhere. His parents were, though, designers. They had both gone to the Rhode Island School of Design. His father, Marty Maloney, had, as a product designer, designed the first Lady Gillette razor and the first floating flashlight. They lived in the only modern house in that area, which he had designed. It was a split-level house with the multiple interlocking spaces, completely, for me, changing my conception of a house as a series of isolated and separated series of rooms. The whole family was everywhere all the time. It was a foreign dynamic, and really fascinating for me. But maybe most importantly, Kevin's father had a small home office with a drafting table, and Kevin and I would sit there and draw rooms, and then tear out things out of out of catalogs, like the Sears catalog, and from magazines, and put them in the drawings, and made our version of spaces. It was the first concept for me, the first time that I thought you could in some ways control or make your world. I didn't know what an architect was then, but it was the first time that I really knew that I wanted to be one. My father had a job, or had then transitioned to a job that moved us around quite a bit over the next years. The first place after upstate New York that we moved to was northwestern Ohio. It was another landscape and culture altogether, completely different and foreign, flat, mostly large soybean fields that seemed to extend to the horizon. We only lived there for a year, but two things made a major impression on me: Kent State, and at the time, the President Richard Nixon. The Kent State shootings had just happened in Ohio. I was old enough to know that it was what everyone was talking about, and we lived in a town, Bowling Green, that was also a university town. So these images had a real presence there as well. I knew that my immediate world was changing in some way. It was also exactly at the moment of the 1972 election. Richard Nixon was up for re-election, and I wanted to be involved. My parents were longtime Republicans, had been involved in the Republican Party, and so I volunteered for the local Nixon campaign. A lot of my friends were furious with me, mad at me. I didn't realize why at first. I was on the wrong side of history at 12 years old. But these were events that also put a kind of rip in the narrative of optimism and progress that I'd felt up until that time, and started me having a stronger understanding of an idea of events in the larger world. We moved again, this time to Connecticut, where my father was transferred back to a main office in Hartford. But the real change in our life was that my mother, who had been, as I mentioned, educated as a teacher, but hadn't worked at all since we were growing up, went back to work, as many women were, to help the family financially. She was accepted into a new training program at Connecticut General Life Insurance Company as a data processor, which was new, as new as having women in this kind of position in the workforce. It was radical in our world for a mom to go back to work, and radical in that kind of corporation for a woman to enter the workforce in anything but an administrative position. And it really made an impression on me and on my friends. Connecticut General had only years before hired Gordon Bunshaft and SOM to design their headquarters outside of Hartford in this very bucolic rolling farmland landscape. It felt like the new to me, that building, all glass, floating on that landscape. On the inside, it was an entire small town with a post office, a barber shop, a bowling alley, restaurant. I got to visit it many times, and even at that age, I could tell that the building had a spirit that somehow communicated something about progress, about an idea of the positive. I was especially taken by a series of interior courtyards that had been designed by Noguchi, each one a small world on its own. It was more evidence that I wanted to be involved in this idea of building, this thing that I started to understand was architecture, especially for the kind of effect and connection to people that it could produce. But as I mentioned, I wasn't a great student. I hadn't taken many of the required courses in high school that I needed to get into architecture school. I had marginal grades. I I started at a school, Wentworth Institute, which was a 2-year technical college in building technology. It wasn't really architecture, but it was as close to it as I could get at the time. And I got to build with wood and masonry. And my favorite class was strength of materials, where we would take materials and put them in a hydraulic machine and break them and see what their properties were. It was a way of starting to get a more physical sense and connection to the world around me. I continued at Wentworth to draw and to draw a lot and to learn how to communicate in 2 dimensions through drawing. And because of that, I was able to get a job with a small group of architects at home during the summer. 3 of the architects in that office had all gone to Rhode Island School of Design, to RISD, and that gave me the idea that not only did I want to get an architecture degree, but I wanted to go to RISD, which I applied to and got accepted to. Beginning at RISD was probably the most impactful and affirming moment in my life. It was an absolute significant point in time for me. I felt like for the first time that I was connected to a culture and a group of people that I had always imagined, but I didn't know if they even really existed. RISD is an art and design school, and that's what everybody does there, seemingly 24 hours a day. The core principle of RISD's education is that everyone, painter, sculptor, graphic designer, architect, starts in a foundation program. The idea is to learn to see critically first. The technical discipline and skills will come after. During my 3rd or 4th week of foundation, I was walking down Benefit Street, which was one of the main streets in Providence, and I found myself in a kind of daydream, just staring at the doors of each of the houses. They're very traditional doors, but I started looking at them in a more abstract way, their color, articulation, what their historical period meant, and it scared me. It really set me back because I realized in some ways something had changed in the way that I saw it, and that I would never see the world in the same way that I had, and certainly not I wasn't going to see the world in the same way that my family did, that my parents saw. Many important things happened at RISD. At RISD, I met my wife, Amy Murphy, who's now a professor of architecture and critical theory at the University of Southern California here in LA, and with whom I have 2 kids, Hannah, who's getting ready to go to law school, and Gus, who is studying art at RISD. It's also a place that I met Rodolfo Machado, who was the head of the Department of Architecture at RISD at the time. And I worked for him and his partner, Jorge Silvetti, who was teaching at Harvard while I was in school. They ran their practice almost like a family, and I became part of that. There was a lot of work, long hours, lots of incredible dinners. I was able to, through them, meet influential architects and thinkers at that moment who would visit their studio and got to talk with them. I got to participate in the Venice Biennale and to go to Venice for the first time. I was able to travel in Europe to see other places where their work was going on, especially in Sicily, to Leonforte and Palermo, which were extraordinary experiences at that time for me. Working with them opened up a whole world for me, as did RISD. They were intellectually, ideologically, deeply involved in architectural discourse. And for me, that idea of how discourse related to the building process of architecture was really eye-opening. It was also a moment in time in architecture where there was a real fight going on between modernism and postmodernism that seemed to be about the very future of architecture. It wasn't clear which side would win or if a new thing would emerge out of that. But to all of us in school, it was deeply important, and we felt involved. Each project we did, each studio project, every review seemed to be a referendum on what architecture was and what its values, histories, and ethics were. It seemed that what was at stake was architecture itself. That's something I believe we, in some ways, are missing today, a deep, almost existential question for architecture. As I was working through my position about these questions in my mind, and maybe because I was at art school, I started looking outside of architecture to art practice for ideas, for inspiration, for an image of a way forward. There were many artists who, at that time, were influential for me. Bruce Nauman, in the way he connected form in unlikely ways. Richard Diebenkorn's plan, like geometric lines, searching for the edge of the frame. Dan Flavin and his use of light, but especially light and color as a material. Richard Serra, though, had probably the most profound and particular influence for me. I went to see his Tilted Arc in New York many times before it was destroyed. I found in Serra's work not an aloof sculptural form, but a way of making form in which the observer became a participant, creating a conversation across space with everything around it. The buildings, their varied histories, the urban life around the sculpture, all animated by one's movement in dialogue with the sculpture as a kind of instigator. The critic Yves Bois wrote about Serra's work at the time that it was a type of almost contemporary picturesque, like the English garden, where there's no one supreme vantage point, as in the order and rationale formality of the French garden, but rather a more openly, almost discursive understanding formed through that meandering experience. I kept wondering if you could make a building in that way. And even more so, could you begin to create urban plans and plan cities that way with the participant in the primary spot of being in a position of a constantly shifting dialogue with form and space that they were animating? I wanted to continue to explore those ideas. And I thought I needed to do that in graduate school. And I was accepted to Harvard's Graduate School of Design after RISD. At the time, Harry Cobb was just entering his tenure as a director of the GSD. Harry became a genuine mentor and a model of how one can live a career of ideas within the challenges of the profession. I miss him deeply. Rafael Mineo had just been named the director and brought an interest in the responsibility of the architect, not just to themselves, but to architecture as a discipline. From him, I began to grapple with the idea of ethics in architecture. But perhaps the thing that ultimately had a huge influence on the direction of my life at the moment was taking a studio with the LA architect Robert Mangurian, who was visiting critic my second year. He was an iconoclastic firework at the GSD, half punk rocker, all dressed in white. He drove a 1970s white Cadillac. Our studio project was in Los Angeles, and we would get to visit that city for a few weeks. We spent the entire week as a group roaming all over LA and seeing everything we could, the full range of the great to the progressive. And we got to see the works of a new generation of architects that seemed to be rewriting the rules of architecture itself. That work and those architects were unlike anything we had been studying on the East Coast. Neither their work nor they themselves looked like tradition, and it was hugely motivating for me. Most of my classmates seemed bewildered and dismissive of LA, but I was not only infatuated, but I also felt strangely comfortable there. It seemed familiar. At first, I thought it was because maybe I watched a lot of TV as a kid and LA was always the backdrop. But then I realized that Levittown and LA both were post-war suburbs. They their underlying structure, their DNA were in many ways the same. And I felt like I intrinsically understood the place. I couldn't wait to get back there. We bought a pickup truck, Amy and I, and we drove across the country. When we arrived, I continued to try to explore and understand the city in a more full way. I bought a old 1966 Volvo 122, and I drove it every place. In our neighborhood of Silver Lake, where we ended up living and where the office started and still is today, I discovered a deep history of modernism that existed there. It was revealing to see that the city was not just about the new, but had an extreme history of innovation as well, that I felt like I could begin to tap into. I began to take pictures for myself of the physical and social landscape, and the city took on a greater and sometimes darker complexity to me. I was hired around this time by Frank Gehry as a designer in his office, his studio, first on the Disney Hall competition. Frank's work and notoriety was exploding at that time, and it was an incredibly dynamic moment to work there. The work on Disney Hall, especially because it was about the emerging cultural position of Los Angeles, introduced me to an idea of what LA believed it might become, it could become, that of a growing cultural center and with growing cultural confidence. I saw how powerful and convincing the image of a building could be. But in the midst of all of that newness for me and optimism of being in a new city, the more complicated reality of LA exploded in the 1992 Rodney King riots. The city had come to believe of itself as a kind of multicultural city. But in fact, it was really a city of many cultures, separated, apart, often with invisible lines demarcating social, political, and economic inequalities. The city's self-perception of itself fell away in an instant. And it called into question for me not only the city, but architecture's role in its future. Can architecture help build community? Can it work toward a more just society? Can it make connections between polarized and separated cultures? Those became issues that were important to me then, and which I'm still grappling in my work with today. Amy and I continued to look at building our community. We became very close to Stuart and Sean Regan during this time, who had a gallery, Regan Projects. They showed a group of artists who really became our friends, but also whose work spoke to the emerging dynamic of Los Angeles. It was influential for me because not only did I eventually do galleries for Sean, but many of my early clients came from both the artists and the art collectors who were associated with the gallery. My first project, and where I want to end, was for an organization called the Inner City Arts. Its goal was to teach art to children in the most disadvantaged areas of the city. It began largely in response to the riots. It hoped to become a center of community and to be an institution that created connection between other cultural institutions in the city, between artists and parts of the city that didn't have access to that emerging idea in the city. It was perfect in a way for me, and it began my work. It encapsulated in many ways everything that I had been working toward, the kinds of questions that I was working for, and it became a launching pad to the work in the future. But here I need to stop, because the rest is possibly less about the architect and really more about the architecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. Can you see me? If you stop screen sharing.
Yes, I can. I think I did.
That's great. The lecture was Yeah, we saw so many insights about your path. That's great. The bad part of it is that we're almost about to finish our 30 minutes slot. But maybe two quick questions. The first question, actually, it will be from the audience. I think that will be a nice question. Is what is the best advice you could give to the new generation of architects?
I would, for me, it was about trying to really question what was at stake for architecture, what the fundamental issue was for architecture, and to be very critical about architecture's role, and out of that, to find things that you feel mean not only something very deep to yourself, but also seem to have a strong effect or importance in culture, and to follow that. Architecture tends to be a long process, and these things don't, those discoveries don't emerge immediately. Putting them in place and acting on them don't happen instantaneously. They have to sustain you for many years of work. I think it's important to ask very hard questions in the beginning of architecture.
You mentioned how important is the fundamental question for architecture, and you are very engaged with social architecture. I wonder what or where would you never build?
I think it depends not so much on a type of program exactly, but on the effect that the project is going to have in culture on society. And I think it's important to look at and evaluate, again, be very critical of each project as it potentially arrives for you. But to also not be dismissive of projects, to not necessarily be, to feel that one has to, I think it's important to be ethical about your position. That's, in my mind, different than having a moral position of a strict, predetermined right and wrong. Architecture lives in great complexity. And that complexity in culture and society is constantly evolving and shifting. And being able to ask ethically what your position might be in that work, and in that work in the long term, will probably help guide you more than it is to say, I have a set of rules of which projects I will and will not take.
Yeah, I understand. That was amazing, your talk. I really enjoyed it. I wish we'll have more time for the interview, but we will talk again during the roundtable discussion. So we look forward to it. Thank you, Michael, for your time. Thank you a lot. And I will see you in half an hour.